May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Sorry, we're up and down all the time. There is a common theme among our readings today. But it's not one that kind of jumps out at you. And the one that everybody remembers, of course, is this one about marriage. It's one that's often quoted to say, well, marriage is between a man and a woman. And that's the way it should be. And it's forever. And that's the way it should be. But often they ignore one part and focus on the other. But this reading, even though it uses marriage as an example, I don't think is about marriage. It is about relationship. It's about our relationships with one another and our relationships with God. And it's about sin. And about the Old Testament understanding of what sin is, which is the breaking of relationships. So this whole bit about, once you are married, you're married forever, is really about investing in relationships and the cost of sin. And marriage is used as an example here because at that time, the cost of divorce was huge. Not for the man. The man, they were fine. But the woman had nothing. She couldn't go back to her birth family. It was unlikely that anyone else would marry her. She had no money that was her own. The only way that women typically had money is if their husband died, not by getting divorced. They were cast out, pushed aside, and had very few options on how to make the money to live. I'll leave those options to you to imagine. So the cost of breaking that relationship is huge. There are three different kinds of sin talked about in the Old Testament. The worst one is the one where you intentionally go out and try to cause damage, try to break relationships. And that is the least common of all. It's horrible, but it's the least common. Then there's the one where through either what you do or what you don't do, you cause relationships to be broken. But it's not intentional. And that's more common. And it's bad. But then there's the one which I think in some ways is the worst, because we don't see it happening. It's the one where we have good intentions, where we set out to do something that we think is a good thing, and the result is broken relationships. And this is the worst one because we do it all the time. And if we don't open our eyes to see, we leave behind rubble. This is the one which was the First Nations residential schools. There was good intention from most people, almost all that were involved in that decision and in that process. But the rubble that's been left behind is devastating. Sin is part of everyone's life. Even that cat. Sorry, there was just a cat that walked across the door there. I'm sure by his, that cat's actions, relationships have been broken. Or at least damaged. But sin is part of all of our lives. We can't avoid it. And sin is part of divorce. But this reading isn't saying, I think, that divorce should never happen. Relationships in marriage are sometimes broken long before it ever comes to that point. And the grace that we have through God is that our sins are forgiven. The worst part that can happen with divorce is if we don't think of it as sin. If we don't think of it as broken relationship. One of the biggest issues we have with today's culture is this idea that everything is disposable. We use disposable plates. We exchange our cars every 3 to 5 years. Or at least a lot of people do. Some even smaller. Cell phones, we don't expect them to last very long. 3-4 years. And the government pushing 3-year contracts down to 2-year contracts. Shortening everything, making everything turn over faster. Our computers, we have to continually replace them with the newer variety. And marriage has become the same. Not for everybody. But when we go into relationships, like marriage, not just marriage, but when we go into relationships, what we're being called to do by this reading, and this is not just relationships with other people, but relationships with those things that we use in our lives, with creation, is to look at them not as disposable, but as permanent. And when we look at relationships as permanent, then we see the cost of breaking them. And we see the effort we need to put into our relationships in order for them to flourish. There's wonderful things happening right here. We have new relationships. They're built on old relationships. It's not that our two churches weren't connected before. But there's a new way of being connected, a new relationship. And I pray that with God's help, going into this, we can see it in that light. None of us are disposable. This isn't just, well, let's try it and see what happens, and if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. there have been permanent changes made. You had to give up your church, the building. You didn't give up your church because the church is you. But the building that you loved, it's become something different. The Anglican church here has become something different. There has been stuff given up. And I think with both, there is an element of loss and grief, but there's also an element of joy, of new life. And that's what needs to be the focus. Investing in that life. We are not disposable. We are part of what God created that was good and was very good. And it would be a sin to not treat that relationship with love, with care, and with as much energy as we have to give. Thanks be to God.